Of all the tales whispered on the winds of Redemption Gulch, none is as potent as the one about the day Sheriff Clayton Thorne, in a fit of cruel arrogance, made the biggest mistake of his life. He saw a down-on-his-luck rancher, Ben Carter, as a target for a heartless joke. He saw his own paralyzed daughter Clara as a useless burden to be cast aside. So for the town's grim amusement, he gifted Clara to Ben, tying them together in a mockery of marriage to settle a debt. What Thorne couldn't see, what his pride blinded him to, was the fire behind his daughter's eyes, a brilliant strategic mind that would soon become the architect of his downfall and the salvation of the very man he sought to destroy. This is the story of how a wicked jest ignited a revolution. The sun beat down on the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch with a merciless intensity, baking the very life out of the parched earth. It was a town that clung to the edge of the frontier, a place where fortunes were as easily lost as they were made, and where power was a tangible currency held tightly in the hands of men like Sheriff Clayton Thorne. Thorne wasn't just the law. He was the town's lifeblood, its puppet master. He owned the saloon, the general store, and the largest cattle ranch in the territory, the Diamond T. His wealth was a fortress, and his badge was the key to every door. Ben Carter, on the other hand, was a man whose fortunes had dried up like a creek in a long drought. His small ranch, the Bar C, was on the brink of collapse. A string of bad luck, a harsh winter that claimed half his herd, a rustler's raid that took the other half, and a mounting debt to Thorne himself had left him with little more than the sweat on his brow and a heart heavy with desperation. He stood before the sheriff's office, hat in hand, the dust clinging to his worn-out clothes, a stark contrast to the polished gleam of Thorne's boots. "Sheriff," Ben began, his voice raspy from the dust and the weight of his plea. "I need more time. Just a few more months to get back on my feet." Sheriff Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He was a man who enjoyed the theater of another's misfortune. He took a slow drag from his cigar, the smoke curling around his silver-streaked hair. "Time, Carter. Time is money, and you, my friend, are fresh out of both." The townsfolk had gathered, sensing a spectacle. Thorne always delivered a good show. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "You know, Carter," he said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I'm a generous man. I believe in second chances." A flicker of hope ignited in Ben's chest, a dangerous, fragile thing. Thorne turned his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. "I'll tell you what. I'll wipe your slate clean. Your debt to me gone. Poof." He waved his hand theatrically. Ben could hardly believe his ears. "Sheriff, I don't know what to say." "But," Thorne continued, holding up a finger, "every gift has a price." He strode to the back of his office and opened a door. A young woman sat in a wheeled chair, her back to the room. "You see, Carter, I have a surplus asset, a burden, if you will." He wheeled the chair around, and the crowd gasped. In it sat Clara Thorne, the sheriff's daughter. A riding accident years ago had left her paralyzed from the waist down. She was a ghost in Redemption Gulch, a reminder of a tragedy. Thorne preferred to forget. Her face was pale, her expression a mask of stoic resignation, but her eyes, a deep, intelligent blue, missed nothing. "My daughter Clara," Thorne announced with a flourish. "She's of marrying age, but as you can see, her prospects are limited." The cruelty in his words was a physical blow. "So here's my offer. You take her, marry her, Give her the rustic charm of your fine establishment." He gestured vaguely in the direction of Ben's struggling ranch. "And your debt is cleared." The crowd murmured a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. It was a joke, a twisted, heartless joke played out for the town's entertainment. Thorn was not just forgiving a debt. He was offloading his broken daughter, turning her into a public spectacle of his own callousness. Ben stared at Clara, at the quiet dignity in her posture, the flicker of defiance in her eyes. He saw not a burden, but a woman trapped by circumstance, a prisoner in her own home. He looked back at Thorn, at the smug satisfaction on the sheriff's face, and something inside him snapped. The desperation that had brought him here was replaced by a surge of righteous anger. He knew what Thorn was doing. He was trying to humiliate him, to break his spirit completely. But Ben Carter was not a man easily broken. He had faced down blizzards, rustlers, and the unforgiving wilderness. He would not be cowed by a bully in a badge. He looked back at Clara, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. He saw a flicker of something unexpected, not pity, but a spark of shared understanding. "I accept," Ben said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. A ripple of surprise went through the onlookers. Thorn himself seemed taken aback for a moment, his smirk faltering. He had expected Ben to refuse to beg to give him more fodder for his cruel amusement. "Excellent." Thorn recovered quickly, clapping his hands together. "The wedding will be tomorrow, a simple affair, no need for fanfare." He then leaned in close to Ben, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "You will treat her with the respect due her station, Carter. But make no mistake, she is your problem now." As Thorn's men unceremoniously loaded Clara and her chair into the back of Ben's wagon, Ben caught another glimpse of her face. The mask of resignation had cracked, replaced by a look of quiet determination. He was beginning to realize that Sheriff Thorn, in his arrogance, had made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was giving Ben a worthless burden. Ben was starting to think he had just been handed a secret weapon. The long, dusty road back to the Bar C stretched before them, a path to an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, Ben Carter felt a glimmer of something more than just survival. He felt a flicker of hope. The journey to the Bar C was a silent one. The only sounds, the creaking of the wagon wheels and the soft sigh of the wind through the tall grass. Ben drove the team with a steady hand, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had acted on impulse, on a surge of defiance against Thorn's cruelty. Now the reality of his decision began to settle in. He had a wife, a woman he didn't know, a woman who couldn't walk. His ranch was a wreck, hardly fit for a healthy man, let alone a woman in a wheeled chair. Clara sat in the back, her gaze fixed on the rolling hills. She said nothing, her silence a heavy blanket over the space between them. Ben glanced back at her occasionally, trying to read her expression, but her face was a carefully composed mask. He wondered what she was thinking, what she was feeling. Was she afraid, angry, resigned to her fate? When they finally arrived at the Bar C, the sight was even more desolate than Ben remembered. The small ranch house sagged in the middle, its porch steps rotted through. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, and the fences were a patchwork of mended breaks. It was a place of quiet desperation, a testament to his long struggle. He pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to Clara. "It's not much," he said, his voice laced with an apology he hadn't intended. Clara surveyed the scene, her intelligent eyes taking in every detail. She didn't flinch, didn't show a hint of dismay. Instead, she turned to him and said, her voice soft but clear, "It's a start. Ben was taken aback by her simple, uncomplaining acceptance. He had expected tears, or at the very least, a look of despair. He carefully lifted her from the wagon, her body surprisingly light in his arms, and carried her into the house. He set her down in her chair, which one of Thorne's men had unceremoniously dumped on the porch. The interior of the house was just as Spartan as the outside. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room, a stone fireplace at one end, and a small curtained-off area that served as his bedroom. He had hastily cleaned the place, but there was no hiding the poverty that clung to the walls like a stubborn stain. I'll fix up a room for you," he stammered, feeling a fresh wave of inadequacy. "This will do for now," Clara said, her gaze sweeping the room. "The first thing we need to do is assess our assets." Ben blinked. "Our assets? Yes," she said, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that surprised him. "You have the land. How many acres?" "About 500, he replied, still trying to catch up. "Water source. A small creek, but it runs year-round. And the livestock?" Ben's face fell. "A dozen chickens and a half-wild Mustang I haven't been able to break." Clara nodded thoughtfully, her mind clearly at work. "The house needs repairs. The barn needs to be reinforced. The fences need to be rebuilt. We'll need lumber nails tools." Ben stared at her, a sense of wonder slowly dawning on him. This was not the broken, helpless woman he had imagined. This was a woman with a keen mind, a woman who saw not problems but solutions. Over the next few days, a new routine settled over the Bar C. Ben worked from sunup to sundown, his body aching with the familiar strain of hard labor. But now, there was a new purpose to his work. He was not just trying to survive. He was building something. And he was not alone. Clara, from her chair on the porch, became the command center of the operation. Her mind was a steel trap, her memory for details astounding. She directed him with a quiet authority, her instructions clear and concise. She had him draw a map of the ranch, and she studied it for hours, identifying the best grazing lands, the most fertile soil for a garden, the most strategic locations for new fences. She had a way of seeing things he had never noticed. She pointed out a stand of sturdy oak trees that could be used for lumber, a patch of wild herbs that had medicinal properties, a natural spring he had overlooked. She was a treasure trove of knowledge, gleaned from years of being confined to a room, with nothing but books for company. One evening as they sat by the fire, Ben finally found the courage to ask her about her life before him. "What was it like?" he began hesitantly, "living with your father?" Clara's face hardened for a moment, the mask of composure slipping. "It was a gilded cage," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He gave me everything money could buy, except for the one thing I truly wanted, his respect." She told him about the accident, a fall from a horse that had shattered her spine and her father's pride. She had been an accomplished rider, a spirited young woman with a love for the open range. After the accident, she had become an embarrassment to him, a symbol of his failure to protect her. He had hidden her away, surrounding her with tutors and books, but denying her any real connection to the world. "He thought he was punishing me," she said, her voice growing stronger, "but he was only sharpening my mind. I read about agriculture, about animal husbandry, about engineering. I learned about the world from the pages of books, and I dreamed of a day when I could put that knowledge to use." Ben listened, a growing sense of admiration welling up inside him. He was beginning to see the true strength of this woman, a strength that had nothing to do with her legs. He was also beginning to realize the depth of his own ignorance. He had been so focused on his own struggles that he had never bothered to look beyond the obvious. He was a rancher, but he knew little about the science of ranching. He had been running on instinct, on tradition, on the same methods his father had used before him. Clara was showing him a new way, a smarter way. A few weeks later, Ben managed to capture the wild mustang. It was a magnificent creature, a fiery spirit with a coat the color of burnished gold. He had tried to break it before, but the horse was too wild, too stubborn. "Let me try," Clara said one morning, as Ben was once again struggling with the horse in the corral. Ben looked at her, then at the wild-eyed mustang. "Clara, it's too dangerous. There are other ways to break a horse than with force," she said calmly. She wheeled her chair to the edge of the corral and began to speak to the horse in a low, soothing voice. She didn't try to touch it, didn't try to force it. She just talked to it, her voice a gentle melody against the backdrop of the wind. The mustang, which had been bucking and kicking slowly, began to calm down. It turned its head towards her, its ears twitching, its intelligent eyes fixed on her. Day after day, Clara sat by the corral, talking to the horse, her voice a constant, reassuring presence. She had Ben leave out a bucket of oats and fresh water, and slowly, cautiously, the mustang began to approach. One afternoon, as Ben watched in amazement, the mustang walked right up to Clara's chair and nuzzled her hand. A bond had been formed, a connection built on trust and patience, not on dominance and fear. It was in that moment that Ben Carter fully understood the gift he had been given. Sheriff Thorne, in his arrogance and cruelty, had tried to saddle him with a burden. But he had unknowingly given him the one thing that could save him, the one person who could see the potential in a broken-down ranch and a broken-down man. He had given him Clara, and together they were going to build an empire out of the dust. The whispers of a forgotten ranch were no longer of desperation and decay. They were whispers of hope, of resilience, of a future forged not by the strength of their bodies, but by the power of their minds and the courage of their hearts. The first green shoots in Clara's meticulously planned garden felt like a miracle. Ben had followed her instructions to the letter, tilling the rich soil near the creek and planting the seeds she'd carefully selected from a catalogue she'd insisted he order. Now rows of corn, beans, and squash promised a harvest that would see them through the coming winter. The barn, once leaning like a drunken sailor, now stood straight and true. Reinforced with timber from the very oaks Clara had pointed out. The fences were not just patched, but rebuilt strong and secure. The Barcy was slowly, painstakingly being reborn. The change was not just physical. A quiet companionship had grown between Ben and Clara. Their evenings were no longer silent. They would talk for hours, Ben describing the physical labor of his day, Clara offering insights and planning the next steps. He found himself looking forward to these conversations, to the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and the gentle, surprising humor that would sometimes bubble to the surface. He learned to see his own ranch, his own life, through her eyes, and the view was filled with a possibility he had never imagined. He even managed to put a saddle on the golden mustang, which Clara had named Sundance. The horse, once a symbol of untamable wildness, now followed Ben with a loyal, trusting gaze, a testament to Clara's patient methods. But their fragile peace was built on borrowed time, and the shadow of Sheriff Thorne and the Diamond T loomed large over Redemption Gulch. Thorne had not forgotten about the rancher who had dared to defy him, nor the daughter he had cast aside. He had expected Ben to fail, to come crawling back broken and defeated. The rumors trickling into town about the improvements at the Bar C were an affront to his authority, a personal insult to his power. The first sign of trouble came subtly. The water level in their creek began to drop. At first, Ben dismissed it as a consequence of the dry season, but the creek had never run this low before, not even in the driest of summers. Clara, with her methodical mind, was not so easily convinced. "Someone is diverting the water upstream," she stated one evening. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the map she had drawn. "The creek originates on Diamond Tea Land. It has to be my father." Ben's jaw tightened. Water was life in this part of the country. Without the creek, their garden would wither, and any hope of rebuilding a herd would be impossible. "He's trying to choke us out," Ben said, a cold anger rising in him. "It's a classic tactic," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. "Control the water, and you control the land. He won't stop at this, Ben. This is just the beginning." Her words proved prophetic. A few days later, Ben rode out to check on a section of his newly repaired fence line, only to find it cut to pieces. The wire was snipped in a dozen places, the posts kicked over. It was a clear message, a deliberate act of sabotage. He spent the next 2 days repairing the damage, his hands raw, his heart heavy with a growing sense of dread. The work he and Clara had put in the small spark of hope they had nurtured felt incredibly fragile in the face of Thorne's relentless pressure. The psychological toll was just as heavy. Thorne's men would ride along the edge of the Bar C property, their presence a constant, silent threat. They would sit on their horses, watching him work, their faces impassive, their intentions clear. It was a war of attrition, a campaign of intimidation designed to wear him down, to make him feel isolated and powerless. One afternoon, as Ben was returning to the house, he found Clara on the porch, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly on the wheels of her chair. A group of Thorne's men were at the edge of the yard, their horses trampling the first rows of her precious garden. They weren't doing anything overtly aggressive, just letting their horses graze, a casual act of destruction that was more infuriating than an open attack. The leader of the group, a hulking man with a sneer permanently etched on his face named Frank, tipped his hat to Clara with mock politeness. "Afternoon, ma'am. Just letting our horses get a little taste of these fine greens." Ben saw red. He dropped the reins of Sundance and started towards them. His fists clenched. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Frank chuckled a deep rumbling sound. "Your land. That's a good one, Carter. Everyone knows this land and everything on it belongs to the sheriff. He just lets you play rancher for his own amusement." "Ben, don't." Clara's voice cut through his anger, sharp and clear. "It's what they want." He stopped, turning to look at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a steely resolve that mirrored his own. She was right. A physical confrontation would be a fool's errand. He was one man against 4. They would beat him senseless and ride away laughing. He took a deep breath, forcing the rage down. He walked slowly towards Frank, his eyes locked on the man's smug face. "Get your animals out of my wife's garden," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Now." For a long moment, Frank just stared at him, the sneer on his face faltering slightly in the face of Ben's cold fury. Then, with a shrug, he signaled to his men. "All right, boys, we've had our fun." They turned their horses and rode away, their laughter echoing back across the trampled cornstalks. Ben stood there for a long time, watching them go, the taste of bitter helplessness in his mouth. He had won the small skirmish, but he knew the war was far from over. He turned back to the house, to the ruined garden, to the woman who had become his partner in this desperate struggle. That night, the mood in the small house was somber. The easy companionship of the previous weeks was gone, replaced by a tense silence. The shadow of the diamond tea had fallen over them, and the future seemed bleaker than ever. "He's not going to stop," Ben said, finally, breaking the silence. "He'll keep coming at us, chipping away, until there's nothing left." Clara was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The quiet observer was gone, replaced by a strategist, a general planning her campaign. "Then we have to stop playing defense," she said, her blue eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. "We have to find a way to fight back. We can't beat him with brute force, Ben. We have to beat him with our minds." She wheeled her chair over to the table, where the map of their ranch lay spread out. "He thinks he's attacking our weakness," she said, her finger tracing the line of the creek. "But he's also revealing his own. His power is built on the belief that he is untouchable. We need to find a way to challenge that belief. We need to find his vulnerability." Ben looked at her, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they were not outsmarted. The shadow of the diamond tea was dark, but Clara was a light, and he would follow that light through whatever darkness lay ahead. The battle for the Bar C had just begun. The days following the destruction of their garden were tense. The air at the Bar C crackled with a new kind of energy, a mixture of grim determination and strategic planning. The small Spartan house became a war room, the rough-hewn table its command center. While Ben worked tirelessly to salvage what he could of the trampled plants and reinforce their defenses, Clara's mind was elsewhere deep in the territory of their enemy. She had Ben ride the perimeter of not just their own land, but the vast expanse of the diamond tea. He was to be her eyes and ears, observing, noting every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. "Don't just look, Ben," she'd instructed him, her voice sharp with purpose. "See, notice the patterns, the routines of Thorne's men, the flow of cattle, the timing of the supply wagons. Information is our only weapon." Ben, accustomed to a life of physical action, struggled at first with this new role of scout and spy, but he trusted Clara implicitly. He rode for hours each day, pushing Sundance to the limits of his endurance, his eyes scanning the landscape, his mind recording every detail to report back to her. He drew her maps of the Diamond Tea's grazing pastures, noted the locations of their line shacks, and timed the comings and goings from the main ranch house. Each evening, he would return exhausted to find Clara waiting, her mind sharp and ready. She would listen intently to his reports, asking probing questions that often revealed details he hadn't even realized he'd noticed. She would then spend hours poring over the maps, her brow furrowed in concentration, connecting dots that seemed miles apart. "He's overextended," she declared one night, her finger tapping a point on the map that marked a distant corner of the Diamond Tea. "His operation is too big, too spread out. He can't be everywhere at once. His control is an illusion maintained by fear and reputation." She began to formulate a plan, not of direct confrontation, but of strategic disruption. It was a plan born of a mind that had spent years studying history, military strategy, and human nature from the pages of books. It was a plan that was audacious, complex, and incredibly dangerous. "My father's greatest pride is his annual cattle drive," she explained, her eyes gleaming with a strategic fire. "It's not just about the money. It's a display of his power, his dominance over this territory. He personally leads the drive to the railhead at Dusty Creek. It's his crowning achievement of the year." Ben nodded. The Diamond T cattle drive was a major event in the region. For a week, Thorne and the bulk of his men would be gone, pushing thousands of head of cattle across the open range. "That," Clara said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "is his vulnerability. When the king leaves his castle, the kingdom is exposed." Her plan was twofold. The first part was designed to hit Thorne, where he was most vulnerable, his ego and his wallet. She had noticed from Ben's reports that a large portion of the Diamond T herd was being held in a remote valley box canyon in the weeks leading up to the drive. The canyon had a single narrow entrance, making it a natural holding pen. If that herd were to wander off, Clara said, her voice laced with implication, it would be a significant financial blow. More importantly, it would be a public humiliation. The great Sheriff Thorne, unable to protect his own prize herd. Ben's heart pounded. "You're talking about rustling Thorne's cattle." "I'm talking about creating a diversion," she corrected him gently. "We won't sell them. We'll simply move them, scatter them, cause chaos and confusion that will take him weeks to sort out. It will delay his drive and damage his reputation." It was a bold, risky move. If they were caught, they would hang. But as Ben looked at Clara, at the unwavering confidence in her eyes, he knew it was a risk he was willing to take. The second part of her plan was even more audacious. While Thorne and his men were distracted by the missing cattle, Ben would execute a carefully planned raid on the Diamond T ranch house itself. "You're not going after money, Ben," Clara instructed, her voice low and intense. "You're going after his ledger." From her years living in that house, she knew her father's secrets. She knew that he was not just a wealthy rancher, but a ruthless moneylender who held a significant portion of the town's businesses and ranches in his debt. He kept a detailed ledger hidden in a safe in his office that documented all of his illicit dealings, the exorbitant interest rates, the illegal foreclosures, the network of corruption that was the true source of his power. "That ledger is his Achilles heel," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "With it, we can expose him for the criminal he is. We can turn the entire town against him. We can break his power for good." The plan was brilliant in its complexity and its understanding of their adversary. It was a psychological attack as much as a physical one, designed to dismantle Thorne's empire from the inside out. But the execution would fall entirely on Ben's shoulders. He felt a knot of fear in his stomach. He was a rancher, not a thief. He knew how to mend a fence, not how to crack a safe. "Clara, I don't know if I can do this." She reached out and placed her hand on his, her touch surprisingly warm and steady. "Yes, you can, Ben," she said, her gaze holding his. "You are more resourceful and courageous than you know. You stood up to him for me, a stranger. You've rebuilt this ranch with your bare hands. You tamed Sundance with patience and kindness. You can do this." Her faith in him was a powerful force, dispelling his doubts, strengthening his resolve. He looked at this woman who had been dismissed as a helpless invalid, and saw a leader, a strategist, a warrior. Her body may have been broken, but her mind was a weapon sharper and more dangerous than any gun. For the next week, they planned every detail with meticulous care. Clara drew him a detailed map of the Diamond T ranch house, from memory marking the location of the safe, the guards' patrol routes, the blind spots. She taught him how to listen for the tumblers in a lock, a skill she had learned from a character in a dime novel. They rehearsed the plan over and over, until Ben knew it by heart. As the day of the cattle drive approached, a nervous energy settled over the Bar Sea. They were about to step out of the shadows and take the fight to their enemy. It was a gamble, a desperate long shot, but it was their only shot. The night before the Diamond Tea Drive was set to begin, Ben stood on the porch looking out at the vast star-dusted sky. He felt a sense of awe at the audacity of what they were about to attempt. He had down on his luck rancher, and Clara, a woman in a wheeled chair, were about to challenge the most powerful man in the territory. He turned to find Clara beside him, her face bathed in the soft moonlight. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of anxiety and fierce determination. "Be careful, Ben," she whispered. "I will," he promised. He knew that he was not just fighting for his ranch anymore. He was fighting for her, for the future they were building together, for the chance to prove that true strength, true power, came not from wealth or brute force, but from the indomitable spirit of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. He was her hands, her legs, her physical presence in the world. And she was his mind, his strategist, his inspiration. Together they were a force to be reckoned with. The game was set, the players were in position, and the first move was about to be made. The night was moonless. A thick blanket of darkness draped over the rugged landscape. It was the kind of night that rustlers dreamed of, and Ben Carter, for the first time in his life, was one of them. He rode Sundance at a slow, steady pace, the golden Mustang moving with a silent grace that belied his sea and power. Ben's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast silence of the prairie. Every rustle of a leaf, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was not alone. Behind him on a sturdy pack mule were the tools of his new trade wire cutters, a set of lockpicks he had fashioned himself from a piece of metal and a long coil of rope. But his most important tool was the map etched in his mind, a map drawn by Clara's steady hand and reinforced by her nightly drills. He reached the entrance to Box Canyon an hour before midnight. Just as Clara had predicted, it was guarded by only 2 of Thorne's men. They were lax overconfident in the natural security of the canyon and the reputation of their boss. They sat by a small fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Ben dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He tethered Sundance and the mule in a thicket of mesquite well out of sight. Then, with the stealth of a predator, he began to circle around the guards, using the rocks and shadows as cover. The plan Clara had devised was simple, but elegant. He wasn't going to engage the guards directly. He was going to create a diversion. From his vantage point on a rocky ledge above the canyon entrance, he could see the vast Diamond Tea herd, thousands of cattle packed together, their dark shapes, a restless sea in the starlight. He took a deep breath, the scent of dust and cattle filling his lungs. Then he lit the fuse of a bundle of firecrackers he had bought in a town miles away, a purchase Clara had insisted on. He tossed the firecrackers onto a dry patch of brush near the guards' horses. The explosion was deafening in the night silence, a rapid series of sharp cracks that sounded like a volley of gunfire. The horses, terrified, reared and bolted, scattering in all directions. The 2 guards, startled out of their drunken stupor, grabbed their rifles and scrambled for cover, shouting in alarm, convinced they were under attack. While they were distracted, firing blindly into the darkness, Ben slipped past them and into the canyon. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He cut the ropes that formed the makeshift gate, and with a series of loud whoops and hollers, he started the herd moving. It was a controlled chaos. He didn't want a full-blown stampede, just a steady, inexorable flow of cattle out of the canyon. He rode Sundance back and forth, nipping at the heels of the stragglers, pushing the massive herd out onto the open range. It was like trying to divert a river, a slow, powerful current of living flesh. For hours he rode with the herd, pushing them further and further away from the Diamond T, scattering them across a wide swath of territory. By the time the first hints of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, the great Diamond T herd was no more. It was 1,000 smaller herds wandering aimlessly across the prairie. The echo of their hoofbeats was a fading memory on the wind. Ben, exhausted but exhilarated, turned Sundance towards the Diamond T ranch house. The second part of the plan was about to begin, and it was the most dangerous part of all. He arrived at the ranch house in the grey light of pre-dawn. As Clara had anticipated, the place was in an uproar. A rider had brought news of the scattered herd, and the ranch was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Men were shouting, grabbing saddles and supplies, preparing to ride out and begin the massive task of rounding up the missing cattle. And just as Clara had predicted, Sheriff Thorne himself was at the center of the chaos, his face a mask of purple rage. He was bellowing orders, his voice raw with fury. The public humiliation, the sheer audacity of the attack on his property had pushed him to the brink. He personally led a large group of his men as they thundered out of the ranch yard, leaving only a skeleton crew behind to guard the house. Ben waited hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He watched as the sun climbed higher in the sky, as the chaos at the ranch slowly subsided. He waited until the remaining guards settled into a routine, their vigilance dulled by the heat of the day and the belief that the danger was long gone. Then, following the detailed map in his mind, he made his move. He approached the house from the back, where Clara had told him a window in the pantry was often left unlatched. It was. He slipped inside his boots, making no sound on the cool stone floor. The house was quiet, the air thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke. He moved quickly, a ghost in the house where Clara had been a prisoner. He found Thorne's office, the door unlocked. The room was a monument to the man's ego, the walls adorned with hunting trophies and expensive furnishings. And there in the center of the room was the safe, a massive iron beast that looked utterly impregnable. Ben's confidence faltered for a moment. This was a far cry from the simple locks he had practiced on at the bar C. He took a deep breath, remembering Clara's words. Listen to the tumblers, Ben. Feel the vibrations. Be patient. He knelt before the safe, his ear pressed against the cold metal. He began to turn the dial, his touch light, his senses focused. He listened not just with his ears, but with his fingertips, feeling for the subtle click as each tumbler fell into place. It was a slow, painstaking process. Twice he thought he had it, only to lose it and have to start again. Outside, he could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A patrol was returning. His time was running out. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly. He closed his eyes, picturing Clara's face, her calm, confident expression. He took another deep breath and tried one last time. Click, click, click. The final tumbler fell into place with a soft, satisfying thud. He held his breath and pulled the heavy iron handle. The door swung open, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Thorne's meticulous, damning script. He grabbed it, his heart soaring with a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph. He was about to close the safe when something else caught his eye. A small velvet pouch tucked into a corner. On impulse, he grabbed it as well. He slipped out of the house the same way he had come in, the ledger tucked safely inside his shirt. He was halfway across the yard when he heard a shout. He had been spotted. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted for the cottonwood grove, bullets kicking up dust at his heels. He leaped onto Sundance's back and urged the Mustang into a gallop, the sound of shouts and gunfire fading behind him. He rode like the wind, the precious ledger pressed against his chest. He had done it. He had faced the lion in his den and stolen his teeth. The first part of their victory was complete. Now it was up to Clara to use the weapon he had brought her to win the war. As he rode back towards the Bar C, towards the woman who had made all of this possible, he felt like he could ride forever. The echo of Sundance's hoofbeats was the sound of their freedom. Ben rode into the yard of the Bar C just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land. He was covered in dust, his body aching with a profound exhaustion, but his spirit was soaring. He slid off Sundance, the heavy ledger clutched in his hand like a sacred text. Clara was waiting on the porch, her face etched with an anxiety she could not entirely conceal. The moment she saw the ledger, her expression transformed. A wave of relief so powerful it was almost tangible washed over her. A slow, brilliant smile lit up her face, a smile that made Ben's weary heart ache with a feeling he was only just beginning to understand. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I knew you could." He handed her the ledger, and she took it with a reverence that mirrored his own. She opened it on the small table they had set up on the porch, her long, delicate fingers tracing the lines of her father's familiar handwriting. For a long moment, she was silent, her eyes scanning the pages, her mind absorbing the damning information held within. Here was the proof of everything she had suspected, everything she had known in her heart about the man who was her father. The illegal land grabs, the usurious loans that had bankrupted honest men, the bribes paid to territorial officials. It was all there recorded in cold, precise detail. It was the blueprint of Clayton Thorne's corrupt empire. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the enormity of what they had accomplished. "This is the key that will unlock his cage." As she was about to close the ledger, the small velvet pouch Ben had grabbed on impulse fell out onto the table. Clara picked it up, a puzzled expression on her face. She loosened the drawstring and emptied the contents into her hand. It was a woman's silver locket, tarnished with age. She opened it. On one side was a miniature portrait of a young, smiling Clayton Thorne. On the other was a picture of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a woman Ben had never seen before. "My mother," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had died when Clara was just a child, and Thorne had removed every trace of her from the house, as if trying to erase her memory. Clara had only a few faded photographs of her hidden away, like forbidden treasures. To see her face here, tucked away in her father's deepest secret, was a shock that struck her to the core. It was a crack in the facade of the monster she thought she knew, a hint of a man who had once been capable of love. But there was no time for sentiment. The storm was about to break. News of the scattered herd and the raid on the Diamond T spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. Thorne and his men returned to town empty-handed and humiliated, their faces grim, their tempers short. The sheriff was a caged animal, roaring and pacing, offering a huge reward for any information about the rustlers who had dared to defy him. His authority, once unquestionable, was now a subject of whispers and speculation in the saloon and the general store. This was the moment Clara had been waiting for. She and Ben worked through the night, meticulously, copying key pages of the ledger. They made dozens of copies, each one a nail in the coffin of Thorne's reputation. The next morning, Ben rode into Redemption Gulch, but he was not the same man who had stood before the sheriff's office, hat in hand, just a few months before. He sat tall on Sundance, his face set with a quiet confidence. He went first to the office of the town's small independent newspaper. He then visited the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, and the dozen other small ranchers and businessmen who had all suffered under Thorne's thumb. To each one he gave a copy of the ledger pages, along with a simple message: the truth. The effect was immediate and explosive. The seeds of rebellion long dormant under the weight of fear began to sprout. Men gathered in small, hushed groups, comparing notes, their anger and resentment finally finding a voice. The evidence was undeniable, written in the sheriff's own hand. They had all been victims of his corruption, and now they had the proof. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the main street right in front of the sheriff's office. It was not a lynch mob, not yet, but it was an angry, determined group of citizens who were no longer afraid. They were led by the blacksmith, a man whose forge had almost gone cold under the weight of a loan from Thorne. Thorne, drawn by the commotion, stepped out onto his porch, his face a thundercloud of rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Disperse at once. Your reign is over." "Thorne," the blacksmith shouted, holding up a copy of the ledger pages. "We know what you are. We know what you've done." One by one, other men held up their copies, a sea of white paper that signaled the end of an empire. Thorne's face went pale. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, faces he had once cowed into submission, and he saw no fear. He saw only contempt and a cold, hard anger. His empire was not built on stone and mortar, but on fear and illusion. And now, with the truth exposed, it was crumbling around him. His men, the hired guns who had been his enforcers, began to back away, sensing the shift in power. Their loyalty was to the highest bidder, and Thorne's currency had just been declared worthless. Desperate, his eyes wild, he looked for an escape. He saw Ben sitting calmly on Sundance at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. A surge of pure, unadulterated hatred contorted Thorne's features. This was all Carter's fault, the worthless rancher who had been the butt of his cruel joke. "You Thorne!" screamed his voice, cracking. He drew his pistol, his movements clumsy, frantic. "This is your doing." He fired not at the blacksmith, not at the crowd, but at Ben. Time seemed to slow down. Ben saw the flash of the gun, the puff of smoke. He reacted on pure instinct, pulling on Sundance's reins, turning the horse just as the bullet flew past, missing him by inches. The crowd gasped, then surged forward. Their anger now ignited into a full-blown rage. They swarmed the porch, disarming a stunned and defeated Thorne. The unraveling was complete. The king had been dethroned not by an army, but by the truth. Later that day, a federal marshal summoned by a telegraph from the newspaper editor arrived to take a subdued Clayton Thorne into custody. As he was being led away in chains, he saw Ben standing by his wagon preparing to leave. For a long moment, their eyes met. There was no triumph in Ben's gaze, only a quiet, weary sadness. Thorne's eyes flickered to the wagon where Clara sat, the silver locket clutched in her hand. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. What could he say? What apology could possibly be enough? He had underestimated her, dismissed her, thrown her away. and in doing so, he had engineered his own downfall. His greatest asset had become his greatest adversary. As the marshal's wagon rumbled out of town, taking the once powerful sheriff to face justice, a new era was dawning in Redemption Gulch. It was an era that had been bought and paid for by the courage of a down-on-his-luck rancher and the brilliant, resilient mind of the woman the world had written off as a joke. The empire of corruption had unraveled, and in its place, something new and hopeful was beginning to grow. With Clayton Thorne's empire crumbled to dust, Redemption Gulch began to heal. Fear was replaced by a council of citizens, and the town, in a gesture of profound gratitude, awarded a vast portion of the now ownerless Diamond Tea Land to Ben and Clara. Their struggling bar C was reborn as a prosperous operation. Neighbors no longer living in Thorne's shadow offered friendship and helping hands, even raising a new, larger house with wide doorways and smooth floors, a house built for Clara. The most profound transformation, however, was in the quiet space between Ben and Clara. The partnership forged in their desperate struggle had deepened into a powerful love. The long evenings of strategic planning gave way to quiet conversations, shared laughter, and dreams for a future that was suddenly bright and limitless. Ben no longer saw a woman in a chair. He saw the strongest, most brilliant person he had ever known, the anchor of his world. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ben knelt before her chair. "Clara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that caught in his throat. "The day your father gave you to me, he thought he was playing a cruel joke. He thought he was giving me a burden." He shook his head, his eyes locked on hers. "He was wrong. He gave me the greatest gift of my life. I love you for your mind, for your spirit, for everything you are. Will you do me the honor of being my wife, not just in name, but in truth?" Tears of pure joy streamed down Clara's face. All her life, she had been defined by her limitations. Ben saw only her limitless strength and spirit. "Yes, Ben Carter," she whispered, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss not of a hero and a damsel in distress, but of two equals, two partners who had faced down the darkness and won their freedom together. Months later, a small package arrived from a federal penitentiary. Inside was the tarnished silver locket and a note from her father. It was not an apology. Thorne was incapable of such a thing, but a stark concession. It read simply, "She had her mother's mind. I should have seen it." Clutching the locket, Clara felt the last chains of her past fall away. The story of the rancher and the sheriff's daughter became a legend in the territory, a tale of how a cruel jest backfired spectacularly. But for Ben and Clara, it was simply their life, one of love, respect, and shared success built on the promise of the open range. They had proven that true potential isn't always what you see on the surface. It's a fire waiting for someone with the heart to recognize its light. And that's the incredible, true-to-life story of Ben and Clara Carter. A testament to the fact that true strength isn't about the power you wield over others, but the courage you find within yourself and in the ones you love. It's a reminder that underestimating someone can be the biggest mistake you'll ever make, and that even the cruelest joke can have the most beautiful punchline. If this story of defiance, intelligence, and unexpected love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a story of the underdog coming out on top, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the heart of the Wild West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Let us know in the comments what part of Ben and Clara's journey resonated with you the most. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next dusty trail.